double-sided. Everything aligns decently. Now we've finished constructing our jig, we need to calibrate it. And to do that, we're going to cut a piece of the card, which is exactly the same size as the interior of this. That's going to be our slug, as it's called, which we will have our tokens printed on, and we will run through the machine. And for now, we just need to work out where the holes are so that we can work out where to lay out our tokens in the software. So the first thing we need to do is reference the size that we need to make our slug, and looking at this, I've got the measurements written down on the bit I cut out, 128 millimeters by 142 millimeters. So my first task is to measure out a 128 by 142 rectangle out of my card, and then I can insert it into my jig, run it through the machine, and we'll see how it works. And just to double check, this should fit perfectly in that jig. There we go, both ends. And again, we should find that this now sits perfectly inside our jig. There we go. Very little play, if any. In fact, just a tiny bit of side by side, which is easily enough accuracy for tokens. And now we simply need to run the jig through the machine. And to do this, we need to assemble the tray and the jig, and our test bit of card goes into the jig. And what we're going to do is we're going to place the die in here, and we're going to put the other plate on top and run it through the machine, which will cause it to cut out a series of circles, in this case, in our test bit of card. So, in order to make sure that we know what we're doing with this test bit of card after it's come out, we need to make a couple of marks. The first one we'll make is just a mark in the corner, so we'll put a little circle in there, and another mark on the edge of the jig itself. So I've now got a little circle matching corners on the jig and the test slug. And that means that we can make sure that we've got our slug aligned correctly. And in the future, once we've made up our template for this, we will know that the little circle always goes in the top left-hand corner, and it identifies which way around to assemble the jig. And the next thing we need to do is denote which way around to put the die in. So we'll find some distinguishing feature. And on this, we've got the manufacturer's logo on the corner here. We've also got some warning triangles on here explaining to not stab yourself in the finger with the cutting die. So I'm going to mark the warning triangles on this corner, this edge of the die, of the jig. And I'm going to mark the manufacturer's logo up on this corner. So I know that whenever I assemble this, I place the logo in this corner and the warning triangles along this edge. And that makes sure that the slug will always go in the jig the same way around, and the die will always go in the jig the same way around. So now we place the other plate in, we run it through the machine, and when it comes out the other side, we will find that it has cut some very neat circles in our test card. And the next step is simply to measure exactly where all of these circles are. We already know the size of the rectangle, so we need to measure exactly where all of these circles are so that we can lay them out in our software on a template that we can then use to create token sheets in the future. Now that we have our test slug cut, the next step is to make a template. And in order to make that template, we need to measure all of the circles, all of the token positions on our test slug, and write down the measurements so that we can work out precisely where those circles need to be drawn on the computer. So we'll have the overall measurements, we'll know how wide it is and how tall it is very easily. but we need to note the distance between the edge of this circle and the edge of the board, the top of this circle and the top of the board, and so on for each of those circles, the distance between this circle and this circle, and so on, so that when we get to the computer, we can use all of those measurements to work out where exactly to draw the circles onto the template, so that we can then use those circles to guide the placement of our graphics for laying out our tokens. So I'm simply going to use a pencil and a ruler and measure the distance between the edge of each circle and the edge of the board. In this case, this one is about 2.5 millimeters, so I'll write 2.5 millimeters in there. And then again, I need to measure the distance from that circle to the top of the board, and that is about 22.25 millimeters. So I'll write that in, and I'll carry on and mark out exactly where all of these circles need to go. A couple of things worth mentioning while you're doing this, which you might have noticed me doing. If you line the test slug up with the lines on your cutting mat, then it means you can be sure that when you're laying your ruler out, you can line it up with those lines. Don't necessarily hit directly on the lines, because they might not necessarily be directly across through the center of the circles. But you can make sure it's parallel with those lines just by eye. And that means you're far more likely to be getting the measurement in the direction you need. Because obviously if you measure it like this, at a funny angle, it's going to be a longer distance, but that's not the distance we're going to be measuring later when we lay it out in the software. So we need to make sure that our measurements are as orthogonal and perpendicular as possible. The other thing to bear in mind is that I've been measuring down to the 1/4 millimeter, because that's more or less the accuracy I can get on my steel ruler. Just go to focus. I have 0.5 millimeters marked out, so I should be able to measure down to about 1/4 millimeter. But realistically, none of these measurements are going to be perfect, and we need to accept that. And we are going to come back and fix them later.
Okay, so we're going to make our template. We've opened up Inkscape. The first thing to do is to lay out a rectangle which is the same size as your slug. We're going to pick a neutral colour like grey for this, so if we just click on one of these colours down here, that will set our fill. And we want to have no stroke, so if you do have a colour shown up here for stroke, then hold down the Shift key and click on this little red X, and that will get rid of your stroke colour. So again, if we wanted a red stroke, we would shift click the red here, and that sets it red up in the top right. Shift click the little X, and it gets rid of the stroke entirely. We want to first draw a rectangle, and it doesn't really matter what size this rectangle is, because the first thing we're going to do is select the rectangle, and in the toolbar here, we can, on the width control, where it says W there, we can change the width of the rectangle, and on the H here we can change the height of the rectangle. First thing we need to do is drop down here and choose millimeters, or whatever units of measurement you've chosen for your measurements. I've measured mine in millimeters, and I know that it's 127.5 millimeters wide. So I'll type 127.5 in that box. My rectangle changes size, and it is 141.75 millimeters tall. Now, it helps for these to be a little bit smaller than the measurements of your aperture in your jig. For example, my jig aperture was technically 142 millimeters tall. I've chosen to make this 1/4 millimeter less tall, because that ensures essentially that once I cut it out and I've got my slug as an actual physical piece of cardboard, then that makes sure it will actually fit in the aperture. 1/4 millimeter is small enough that any misalignment by that degree is not really important, but you do need to make sure your slug does actually comfortably fit inside that aperture, otherwise you'll be constantly trying to bend it and force it in, and that might cause misalignment later. Now we've got our template rectangle the right size, we need to start laying out our tokens in it. So the first thing to do really is you want to draw a shape which represents the size of your tokens, and in this case I'm doing a 1-inch circle. So I'm going to draw a circle, and again it doesn't matter what size it is because I can select it and come up here and change it to inches, 1 inch wide and 1 inch tall, and now that is perfectly sized. However, if I move this over the top of my rectangle I can't see it because it's the same colour, so I'm now going to change this to be red because that's nice and visible, and I will definitely be able to see that over the top of the grey. So the way we're going to line up our circles is using snapping, and if you've seen the tutorial on laying out cards you'll probably have seen this before. In order to use snapping you first need to turn on the snapping toolbox, which is on the right hand side of the page here, and if you don't have it visible already you can go into the view menu, show and hide, and snap controls bar. So if I turn that off you see it disappears, and again show and hide, snap controls bar to make it reappear. You need to make sure this first button is depressed, so it looks like it's pressed in like that. That just turns on snapping in general, and I want to turn on bounding box snapping, and I want to snap the corners of bounding boxes and also the edges of bounding boxes, which means that when I drag my circle around it will snap neatly to the edges. Either the corner will snap to an edge or an edge will snap to an edge of a bounding box like this, and that makes it very easy to line stuff up. So in order to line up each of my circles in my grid, so I mean roughly speaking I've got one there, and I've got one there, and I've got one there, and one there, and one there, and so on, but I'm not going to get anywhere near accurate if I just drop them all in at random like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create some rectangles which are the sizes that I previously measured off of my sheet. So the one that sits here, for example, needs to sit 26.5 millimeters in from this side, from the left, and 5.5 millimeters down from the top. So I'm going to create myself two rectangles, and this one, it doesn't matter how tall it is, but it doesn't matter how wide it is, so I'm going to go up and change the width on this to that 26.5 measurement, and that needs to be 26.5 millimeters. That's how far in it is from the left, and then I'm going to make another rectangle which is wide, and that needs to be 5.5 millimeters tall, and that's how far this first circle is down from the top. And again, just to make sure I can tell them apart, I'll select both of those, drag a box around them, or click and then shift click to add to the selection, and I'm going to make both of those yellow, because like that I can tell them apart from the rectangle that's the background, and I can also tell them apart from the circles. So this one needs to be a measurement down from the top. This is 5.5 millimeters down from the top, so I'll just snap that to the top of the template rectangle. And again, this one needs to be 26.5 millimeters from the left, so I'll snap that to the left of the rectangle, and now I can just drag my circle in and it will snap neatly into place. And as it happens, because this I snapped up to the intersection between those two bounding boxes, so it's snapped onto the corner of this one, I can just drop this one directly in place and its top left corner will snap to the top right corner of that spacer, and it's exactly in position. Okay, so how about the next one along, which goes around here somewhere? That also is 5.5 millimeters down, but it is 21.75 millimeters across, so I can take my horizontal spacer and change that to 21.75 millimeters wide. I can snap this onto the side of my previous circle, and then snap my new circle onto the side of that. For now, we've got it aligned horizontally, but we don't have it aligned vertically, and this is going to be common all the way around here. We're going to have to move stuff up and down separate to horizontal. So I'll now move this spacer out of the way so I don't accidentally snap to that anymore. So if I click this and start dragging it around, I can hold down the Control key to constrain it to only move in 4 directions, either up, down, left or right, and it won't move it will lock to one of those axes. I can't move it out diagonally down here. So that means I can drag it down, I can place my spacer in, snap that to the top. It still needs to be 5.5mm from the top, and then I can drag this, hold the control key so I'm only moving up and down, and then drag it until it snaps in place there. And I know it's already correct horizontally, so I didn't move it horizontally at all, and that's what the constraint of the movement holding the control key is useful for. So our next one is going to be 2 points. We're going to place the one which goes down here somewhere, and this needs to be 2.5mm from the left. So that's quite a thin spacer there, and again we can drop it in place. And then this one needs to be 22.25mm from the top, so I'll change my height to 22.25mm and snap this to the top, and you'll see this now actually overlaps one of our existing circles. So I've already aligned it horizontally. I can move this out of the way and then move this up, holding control to constrain it to the axis until it snaps in place against that yellow spacer. And then we can continue in much the same fashion. Our next one needs to be 22mm across from here, so it'll bring it out to here somewhere, and then 23mm down from here, so it will sit in that space somewhere. And we can continue measuring off of either the left hand side, the top side, maybe even the right hand side for some of the ones which are closer to the right hand side than the left, and also off of other circles until we have laid out all of the circles in our template. If you end up in a situation like this, where I'm trying to snap this yellow rectangle onto this circle here, sometimes you'll find that you just can't get it to snap to the right thing, and it snaps to this thing over here, or it snaps to this thing, but it won't snap onto the one you actually want to line out with. As it happens, I can just about get it to there. But if you're having trouble, then one thing you can do to make sure that the things that you want to be snappable are snappable, and the things that you don't want to be snappable are not snappable, is that you can create a new layer, and we'll call this top layer just to make it clear. And you create a new layer with this little plus sign on the layers palette, and then you can click your object you want to snap and also your object which you want to snap to it. Hit shift click to select both at the same time, and then right click and choose move to layer. So we're now moving both of these to top layer. Move. Now all of the other objects remain on layer 1. If we now lock layer 1, so we hit this little padlock icon, now turn off layer 1, hit this icon, and now it will no longer snap onto anything on layer 1. You can snap it perfectly into place onto the one object you care about, and then turn everything else back on again. Once you're done, and you no longer need this object and this object to be the only ones you can select or snap to, you can select them again, right click, move to layer, layer 1, and now our top layer has nothing in it. We can show it and hide it and nothing changes. We can even delete it now if we want to. Everything is now back on layer 1. We can't select it because we've locked it, but we can unlock layer 1 and continue with our work. And you might notice that in order to avoid getting confused with locking onto this or locking onto this, I'm placing my spacer further down the page so that I can lock specifically onto the one circle, snap specifically onto the one circle I care about. And then I'm using the control axis locked movement to move it up into position in order to snap my circle into position against that spacer. Okay, so now we're done laying out our template. we've got all of our circles from our die laid out according to the measurements that we took from our test slug. There's just a couple more things to do. Firstly, we can get rid of these spaces. So if I select them both, delete those. Next, we want to create a small circle in the top left corner here. And just as a general tip, if you are dragging, you drag a circle much like a rectangle to create it. If you hold down the Control key, it will lock to a certain kind of aspect, so you can more easily drag it out at roughly 45 degrees and it will make a perfect circle. So I'll just drop that there. And that just reminds us of which corner is the top left corner, because we also, if you recall, drew a little circle on our jig, and that matches up to that top left corner. So we will always make sure that we put this slug in the jig the right way around by using that circle there as a reference. The other thing we need to do is change this to outlines, because we don't want to have to print a giant grey rectangle with lots of red circles on it. So instead of that, we're going to change this to outlines. So just before we proceed, I'm going to save this off as a 1-inch circle template. Like this, I've got my layout preserved just in case I mess anything up now. If we select absolutely everything, we should be able to hold down Shift and select black to give everything a black outline, and then without holding down anything, click the little red cross here to take away the fill from everything. And there we have our initial template. If we want to change the thickness of that outline, then we can go to the Object menu and select Fill and Stroke. This will give us an entirely new palette. You see it's arrived here over the top of the Layers palette. If we click the Stroke Style tab here, we can now change the thickness of our stroke. I'm going to change this to 1/4 of a millimeter, 0.25 millimeters, because that means that it will be thick enough to see. The 0.1, the 1/10 of a millimeter outline sometimes doesn't print very well on some printers. And the final step is simply to print this out, because what we need to do now, we've got our template drawn out. What we need to do now is print it out, cut it out to the outline, run it through the machine, and see how accurate our placement of all of these circles is.
Now we have our template printed out, and you can see it matches up with our previously cut test slug. We can now just cut this out, run it through the machine, and see whether it fits. Now, it almost certainly won't, and we'll nearly always have to go back and make some adjustments, like move the little circles a millimeter or two randomly. And largely that comes from just inaccuracies in the measurement, inaccuracies in the actual size of the holes. Sometimes it'll say it's a 1-inch template, and it'll actually be a 1.015-inch template or whatever. But, you know, it's inevitable. You'll have to do some adjustments, so that's why we just print it on cheap printer paper first and see how it goes. Okay, so first up, I'm going to use a knife and a ruler to simply cut out this template. And while we're cutting out this template, we want to get pretty much dead on those black lines where we can. Just make sure that's perfectly aligned. And the advantage of this method with the wooden sides is that the die is held precisely in place. You can double check the alignment if you really need to by flipping the whole thing over and checking it from the back. And as you can see, this could actually be a little bit longer in this dimension in particular. We've got another millimeter or so to play with before we actually hit the edge of the aperture. So that's probably an adjustment we'll need to make on our template. Anyway, we'll see how accurate it is. Just double check which side it is actually butted up against. So it's up against the bottom side, because that will make a difference when we make our cut. We'll run it through. And see how the cut went. You can see here that several of these cuts are a little bit out of alignment. So partly this might be because we cut a little bit off of the top, or we had it butted up against this side and not this side. So if this were up that way, then the cuts would have been closer to these lines. But as you can see, for example, this one is more or less spot on. There's a little bit of misalignment down here. This one is almost exactly in place. These ones are off that way, off that way, off that way. So we're going to need to do some adjustment, which is expected. So we simply take our ruler and our pencil, and we should be able to check which or how much each of these needs to move. And it's easiest if you can move them just in the vertical or the horizontal direction, or at least measure how much they need to move in each direction. So for example, this one here, this circle, looks like it's out of alignment in about that direction, but it's going to be easier for us later when we get to the computer if we measure how far it is out that way. So it looks like it's about 3/4 of a millimeter out that way, and how far it is this way vertically, and again that looks like maybe a millimeter. So we need 0.75 in that direction and 1 in that direction, rather than measuring how far it is in this direction, because later on when we get to the computer and we're moving these little circles around, it's going to be easier for us to move it twice, once horizontally by 3/4 of a millimeter and once vertically by 1 millimeter, than it is to try and work out what that diagonal angle is and so on. The other thing we need to do is remember that we actually needed to add about a millimeter to the top of this. So I'll just write +1 millimeter up there, and that will remind me when I get to fixing my template that I need to add an extra millimeter to the top in order to fill out the aperture in the die. So I just need to go around all of these circles, see which ones are out of alignment and need to be fixed and by how much. And as I said, stuff like this, where there's a tiny sliver of misalignment, that's fine, because realistically, whatever we do, there's going to be a little bit of misalignment every time we cut with this anyway. Okay, and as you can see, nearly all of these are out by less than a millimeter in any particular direction, so it's pretty close. We've done a fairly good job on the first pass. Now we just need to go back to the computer and make all these adjustments.
So here we are back in Inkscape. We've got our template loaded up again, and we simply need to move each of these circles by the amount that we noted down off of our test cut. And we should simply be able to make sure that our test cut is the same way up. Look at the reference circle, compare it to the one in the test cut, and then select each circle in turn and move it by the noted down amounts. The easiest way to do this is to use the transform palette. So if we go into the object menu and select right down the bottom here, transform, that opens another new palette on the right here, and this allows us to move, scale, rotate, skew, or whatever the object that we have selected. The first thing to do is to check that this units drop down here is in whatever kind of unit you measured your offsets in. I'm using millimeters, so I select millimeters in there. I select my first circle, and I type in the horizontal offset and the vertical offset. Now, as these icons on the side here indicate, horizontal goes positive, moves to the right, negative moves to the left, and vertical, positive moves upwards and negative moves downwards. So for our first circle, which needs to move up and to the right a bit, then we need positive numbers in both cases. So horizontal movement is 0.25 millimeters, and the vertical movement is 1.5 millimeters. You want to check the relative move button, because otherwise you'll be editing the absolute position of this relative to the bottom left corner of the document, which is not that useful. So if you just check that relative move, then when we hit the apply, it will jump as far right and up as we have specified. If you uncheck that, it will move to 0.25 millimeters right of the bottom left corner of the document and 1.5 millimeters up of the bottom left corner of the document. So we leave relative move checked. If we just apply that, we'll see it move ever so slightly, and that's that circle done. So we can move on to the next one. Bear in mind, because we've removed the fill from all of these, clicking in the middle does nothing, because there is actually none of the object there. You have to click onto the outline in order for it to be selected. And this one is 0.75 to the right and 0.75 up. And if we apply that, you'll see it jump in position. Now we just have to keep going through all of these and enter each of the numbers as we meet the circle. You make sure you don't move any circle twice by accident. Okay, and now all of our movements are done. We also need to remember that we need to resize this to have an extra millimeter at the top. Now, if we just change the height here, it will scale out from its center, which means it'll have an extra 0.5 millimeter on the top and 0.5 millimeter on the bottom. So we could do that and then move all of our circles down by 0.5 millimeter, but it's actually going to be easier to create another rectangle. We're going to change this to be 1 millimeter tall, and then we can snap this into place. And for some reason snapping doesn't work when you resize. I'm assuming there's a really good reason for it, and it's not just Inkscape being rubbish, but it doesn't. So instead we're going to zoom in really far and then resize this just so by eye we've got it lined up with the top there. As you can see, we're moving quite a way down our screen for 1 millimeter of movement, so it doesn't matter if it's a little bit out anyway. And if we zoom out again, we can just delete that new reference rectangle. And our template is now ready to print and try again.
Here's our new template. And the test we could have done last time, but on the first pass it's kind of pointless. Just to double check that we think the alignment is good, we can take our test cut, making sure the registration circle is in the right corner, and just line it up with the top left there of our printed sheet. And if we look at that, for the most part that looks spot on. Now there's a couple of slight discrepancies, like this circle here looks like it could probably go that way. Probably about 1 millimeter. There's no point writing in the circle because the circle is going to be cut out, but we'll see how it goes when we cut it. Yeah, we need to make sure that it fits properly, and if anything this time it's a little bit too long. You can see that it's not actually quite sitting down at the end there. So we'll need to take about 0.5 millimeter off of the bottom end. And I'm just going to do this by eye. Obviously you could measure this if you really wanted to. That now fits pretty much perfectly. So we can take our die, make sure it's the right way around, drop it on top of there, check the alignment from below. Now it fills out the cavity pretty well in every direction. Let's run it through and see what happens. This one circle needs to be moved back that way a bit. And then we probably want to move this one just a little bit that way as well. Other than that, maybe this one as well. So we've got one there, one there, one there, maybe this one. But stuff like this, where you've got a tiny little sliver of the black line appearing around the outside of the die, that is largely unavoidable. This is the best one we have by the looks of it. But realistically, stuff like this, where you are less than 0.5 millimeter out of alignment, it's not worth trying to do anything about it because you'll be chasing that 0.5 millimeter back and forth forever.
Okay, the last step is we need to turn this into a pair of images because we want one block for the fronts of our tokens and another block for the backs of our tokens. If you only want one-sided tokens, obviously you don't have to do this, but it will help if you want two-sided tokens to have a template for both sides. So I'm just going to write a label that says front in much smaller text than that, just so I can drop that onto the front side to remember which one it is. Now I'm going to group this because this is now done. It's a single object as far as I'm concerned. So now I can move it around as a single object. I'm going to copy it and paste it. And now this one I want to be my rear. So first of all, I'll ungroup it and move that text out. Change the text so that it says rear. But for this bit, because this is going to be pasted on the underside of our slug, the bit of card that goes into the die, I'm going to flip it left to right. If I go into the transform dialog up here and just change the width to -100, it's the same scale but flipped left to right. There we go. So now this is the correct layout of all of the holes on the underneath of the slug, so I can put that rear back on and then regroup it all to be my rear face. Now conveniently these don't both, even if I want a little bit of space between them so it's easier to cut the labels out later, these don't both fit on the page that way around, so I'll have to rotate them around. And again, remember, hold down Control, you can rotate in discrete angles, and now they fit on the page fine. Obviously once these are cut out they'll just be circles, so it doesn't matter which way around the template is when we are actually laying out those graphics. I'll just save that, and that's now my finished 1-inch circle template, ready to be loaded up with artwork. So the file I'm going to use is the tokens from Inspector Moss 2 House Arrest. This is one of my favourite solo print and play games, and we have a number of suspect counters, some police counters, and some clue counters. And obviously we won't fit all of these onto one slug. We'll have to just do a selection. And on one page we've got the fronts, and on the other page we have the backs, which have various different symbols on. And while these are on square and round tokens in the file, I'm going to put all of these on round tokens because they're nicer anyway. Okay, so much like we did with the card layout, if you've seen the tutorial on laying out your cards into a template, we can simply open this in Inkscape. There's my IM tokens, and then use the clipping function. So I zoom in on the token that I want to start with. We'll start with a couple of these suspects. I draw a rectangle which covers my graphics entirely, and in this case I just want to have as close a crop on those graphics as possible. And then I select that, and I also select the image behind it. Hold down Shift, click the image, right click and set clip, and that will cut out just the rectangle I've provided out of the image behind it. So now it's just one single suspect. If I copy that and paste it into my template, I just have that one suspect image into my template. So I can now go on to the zoom in up here and then resize this chap to fit into my template. Now firstly I'm going to turn snapping off, because now I'm just moving random graphics around. It's actually a little bit annoying for it to be snapping onto everything, so I went up and toggled snapping with that top button. Secondly, you might notice that the white from the image is getting in the way of our template a little bit. So what we're going to do is we're going to start working with layers. So we can close the transform and the fill and stroke palettes now, and we just care about the layer palette. This layer here I'm going to right click and rename and call template. That's the layer that we want to have all of our lines on. And I'll cut this chap again so that I can paste him into a new layer I create called artwork. What we want when we're done is to have our artwork entirely covering up our template, so that there's our chap again. Now he's on the artwork layer, so that these circles don't show up on our final print. However, to start with, we want our artwork layer below our template layer, so we just drag it down below, because like that we can move our thing along and we can see the circle of the cut over the top of the graphics. So I'm going to have to scale this chap, and again hold down the Control key and you should be able to scale him proportionally, just so he fits inside that circle. And try and keep a millimetre or two away from the edges of the circle at all times, just to be on the safe side. You can adjust the position with the arrow keys if you want to, or you can just drag him around and line him up as best you can. Obviously remember, these cuts will sometimes be ever so slightly out of alignment, so don't line your artwork up with the absolute edge if you can avoid it, because you will almost certainly have trouble with that later on. We can right click here, release clip, we get the rest of our artwork back, and then we can draw another rectangle around another token front, select the image as well, right click, set clip, and we've got another cutout picture for the next token along. And again, I managed to drag the template this time because it's the top layer, so it's actually convenient to lock the template layer just to make sure I can't do that. Now I can only operate over the artwork layer and everything's safe. Okay, and now I'm just going to go through and select a few more of the images to fill out the rest of the template. Okay, so now we've finished filling out our fronts. We have a selection of suspects, of police tokens and clues. We now need to go onto our backs. Now remember, this is mirrored, so if we zoom out a bit more you can see on the fronts our registration mark is in this top right corner. On the backs, the registration mark is on this bottom right corner. So this front here will line up with this back here. This front here will line up with this back here, and you need to bear this in mind when you're putting the backs on your tokens, especially in cases like this where the different fronts might have different types of token on, so there'll be actually more than one type of back here. And the other thing to bear in mind, of course, is that this is going to be flipped up and around onto the back of this sheet, so the icons on this one need to be upside down if you care about them lining up with the front. So we need to reopen the same PDF file, and this time look at the second page with the backs on. And there'll be less back and forth here, obviously, because we'll be able to reuse the same image for more than one token. You might be able to get away with. Now, right here, if you draw a rectangle around this magnifying glass, you may find that down here you're actually clipping off a bit of that outline. So we can avoid that by using a circle instead, and exactly the same thing applies. You can still use set clip, and it'll cut you out a circular section of that image. And just to demonstrate that it is in fact a circular section, if we zoom in here when we need to paste it anyway, if we move that over the top, you can see it actually is a circular selection as we move it over the top of other things. So we'll scale that down a bit until it fits easily within our circle. And just for good form, realistically it doesn't matter with an icon like this, but we will rotate it around until it is exactly upside down as well. And then we'll copy that and paste it several more times for the other clue tokens here. So now that's all of our artwork laid out in the right place, on the right part of the template. Now I want to move the template down below the artwork again, and you'll notice that sometimes it'll be fine, but other times some of your cut lines are covered up, but not all of them. We don't want any of those cut lines there, because otherwise, if we leave them there and the cut is a little bit off, then we'll see a little bit of that black around the edge of the token, and that won't look good at all. So what we're going to do is we're going to create another layer in between the two, and we'll just call it blanking or something like that. So this is over the top of the template layer, underneath the artwork layer, and we'll just get a big white fill rectangle. And again, I'm using shift click on the X to remove the stroke from this shape, and I just want to cover up all of those circles. Now I need to be careful not to cover up the registration circle, and I need to be careful not to cover up the bit that tells me which side of the token sheet it is, although that should be fairly obvious. But other than that, I want to cover up all of the black lines. So I should be left with, on each side, just the artwork, the registration mark, the label telling me whether it's the front or the rear, and the outline telling me where to cut. and then I print this out on a sheet of label paper.
So we've got our sheets printed out, our Inspector Moss tokens, and we now need to get them adhered to a bit of card so we can then run them through the machine and cut out individual tokens from them. I'm going to use this bit of grey board. It's about 1 millimeter thick, and the first step is simply to roughly cut out the fronts. Stay a few millimeters away from the line at this point and just do a fairly rough job of cutting out the front shape. So you see we've still got the lines around the outside, a couple of millimeters of border, and just stick this down somewhere onto your card. It's a bit of mess around the edge where it's got dropped or something, but. And next we need to cut this out very precisely around those lines. So we have exactly our slug, our bit of card ready to put in the machine, but with the label only on one side. And again, I'm making these cuts right on the black lines, which are fairly thin, only 1/4 millimeter wide, and therefore I should be pretty assured that if I cut down this black line, I get a slug that fits inside my jig. So there's our slug. We can test this out, make sure that it does in fact fit inside the jig. It's a little bit on the long side, so again I'm going to take just a small amount off of the back there by eye. Small sliver. And now it more or less fits. There we go, we can get it all 4 corners down and it's ready to go through the machine. Except it isn't. There's nothing on the other side. So, at this point, we have to take our back, carefully marked as rear, and cut this out equally carefully right up to the black lines. And if you do have the choice between going a little bit over or a little bit under, then it's better to cut a little bit more off here than a little bit less. But remember that any error at this point will result in a slight misalignment of your tokens. Now, we have to take our fronts and stick this onto the back, and we can use our registration mark to make sure that it gets folded around to the correct side. It should now be exactly the same size, right up to the corners. We should be able to line the two up pretty precisely and have it match all the way around on all the corners. So we'll peel up one of these corners, and again this bit isn't going to be a token, so it doesn't matter if we mess up the corner a little bit. And as we've done before with labels, we need to peel back just about 1 centimeter from the end there, so that we can still rearrange it and get the position correct before we stick it down, but we've still got plenty to stick down on the end here. I want to make sure that the alignment is correct. Those 2 registration marks are in the same corner of the thing. And then I just want to line it up on 2 corners. And you see those are now pretty much lined up perfectly. And I can now smooth it right the way down to this side, stick this stickied edge down to the card, and pull the backing out, smooth the entire label down, and these corners are still pretty well aligned. So there we have our fronts and our backs of our tokens on a single slug, ready to go in the machine. So we take our jig, line our slug up into it, make sure that the registration mark is in the same corner, the front side is facing up, make sure that it fits into the jig, place our cutter with our alignment marks, our warning triangles on that side, our company logo on this side, over the top, ready to make the cut, and the other sheet, wind it through the machine, and we should end up with, on the other side, sheet of nicely cut tokens. We can just pop these out more easily than your average punch board because there's no little tabs holding them in place. They don't need to survive shipping. And we have some pretty good game tokens. Double-sided. Everything aligns decently. And we made them at home.